Marcus Walker dropped his radio, the device clattering against granite as his weathered hands froze mid-reach. The massive black bear wasn't attacking. She was pleading, her dark eyes locked on his with a desperation he'd seen only once before, in his dying son's hospital room. This wasn't just any bear bleeding out in the Wyoming wilderness. Sarah Chen's medical bag slipped from her trembling fingers as she recognized the distinctive white patch above the animal's left eye. Emma Rodriguez stumbled backward, her ranger training forgotten, as the impossible truth hit them all like a physical blow. This was Bella, the orphaned cub Marcus had bottle-fed 15 years ago, now dying in labor with a bullet wound festering near her birth canal. The same gentle giant who'd once curled up in his lap was now trusting him with her unborn cubs' lives, her massive paw extended toward the man who'd raised her. "Dear God," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking with the weight of recognition and dread. What promise could be worth risking everything for? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, Marcus Walker had been counting down the days until his mandatory retirement, his 65th birthday looming like a storm cloud over Yellowstone's endless horizons. The Vietnam veteran turned park ranger lived alone in a weathered cabin that still smelled like Helen's lavender soap, 3 years after cancer had stolen his wife of 37 years. Her wedding ring hung on a chain around his neck, clicking softly against his son Tommy's dog tags, the only sounds that broke the suffocating silence of his evenings. The medical bills from Helen's final year had drained their savings and mortgaged their future. $47,000 in debt, Marcus survived on instant coffee and canned soup, his ranger salary barely covering the minimum payments. Yet every spare dollar went toward his unofficial wildlife rescue operation, a habit that had earned him both admiration and reprimands from park headquarters. Walker's Way, they called it, his unconventional methods of saving injured animals that other rangers had written off as lost causes. Dr. Sarah Chen understood that desperation intimately. At 45, the veterinarian carried her own burden of regret and debt, $200,000 deep from her mother's Alzheimer's care. Her marriage had crumbled under the weight of missed dinners and emergency calls, her ex-husband's parting words still echoing, "You care more about dying animals than living people." Now her mother sat in a memory care facility, staring through Sarah with vacant eyes that no longer recognized the daughter who'd sacrificed everything for her care. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that she treated Marcus's rescued wildlife for free, finding in their recovery the redemption her human patience couldn't provide. In the past year alone, she'd performed surgery on 17 bears, 32 elk, and countless smaller creatures that Marcus carried to her makeshift clinic in his truck, his gentle hands somehow convincing wild animals to trust human intervention. Emma Rodriguez watched this unlikely partnership with the keen eyes of someone who understood abandonment. At 28, the junior ranger had clawed her way up from the foster care system, her ambition fueled by a desperate need to belong somewhere permanent. Marcus had become her mentor, the father figure she'd never had, though she carefully maintained professional distance. Her promotion to senior ranger hung on following protocol, on proving she could lead without the emotional complications that seemed to follow Marcus like morning mist. What Emma didn't know was that Marcus saw something heartbreakingly familiar in her determination, a reflection of the daughter he'd given up for adoption 28 years ago when he and Helen were too young and too broken to raise a child. The sealed adoption records had kept them apart, but Marcus had quietly funded her education through anonymous scholarships, watching from afar as she grew into the woman he'd always hoped she might become. None of them knew that their carefully constructed lives were about to collide with a force more destructive than any natural disaster: the return of Jake Thompson, the foster son Marcus had failed to save, now carrying a rifle and 15 years of festering hatred. The morning mist clung to Yellowstone's ancient pines like Helen's favorite shawl, soft and familiar, as Marcus began his final patrol of the Lamar Valley. In 3 weeks, mandatory retirement would end his 40-year career, though the thought of leaving felt like tearing roots from stone. His radio crackled with Emma's voice reporting normal conditions from the northern sector, her tone professional as always, hiding the warmth he sometimes glimpsed when she thought no one was looking. At 6:47 a.m., Marcus rounded the familiar bend near Specimen Creek and stopped cold. The massive black bear lay motionless beside the water, her distinctive white chest patch immediately recognizable even from 50 yards. Bella. The orphaned cub he'd bottle-fed 15 years ago had grown into a magnificent 400-pound sow, but something was terribly wrong. Dark stains matted her fur, and her labored breathing created visible puffs in the crisp morning air. "Control, this is Walker." "I've got a situation at Grid 77, Marcus radioed, his voice steady despite the ice forming in his stomach. "Large female black bear, appears injured, requesting veterinary assistance." As he approached on foot, Bella's head lifted weakly. Their eyes met across 15 years of separation, and Marcus felt the familiar tug of recognition. This was the same cub who had curled against his chest during those long nights in the ranger station, refusing to drink from anyone else's hands. Her dark eyes held the same trust now, though clouded with pain and something else, protective desperation. "Easy, girl," Marcus whispered, kneeling 10 feet away. "Let me see what's wrong." Bella shifted slightly, revealing the swollen curve of her belly. Pregnant, late term by the look of it. But the wet crimson spreading beneath her told a more urgent story. Fresh blood, too much of it, and the metallic smell that meant internal damage. Marcus's trained eye caught the telltale entry wound near her hindquarter. A bullet hole, maybe 12 hours old. His radio buzzed. "Marcus, it's Sarah. Emma called me in. What are we dealing with?" "Gunshot wound, late pregnancy, significant blood loss," Marcus replied, never taking his eyes off Bella. "She's going into labor, Sarah. Right now." Dr. Sarah Chen arrived 20 minutes later, her veterinary kit bouncing against her hip as she jogged down the rocky slope. Emma's ranger vehicle pulled up behind her, emergency lights casting red and blue shadows across the creek bank. Both women stopped short when they saw the scene. Marcus sitting cross-legged near the injured bear, speaking in low, comforting tones while Bella's breathing grew increasingly labored. "Jesus, Marcus," Emma breathed. That can't be the same bear." "It's her," Marcus confirmed quietly. "Bella, I'd know that white patch anywhere." Sarah knelt beside her medical bag, professional assessment warring with emotional recognition. She'd assisted with Bella's care as a young veterinary student back when Sarah still believed she could save everything that crossed her path. "Marcus, she's lost too much blood. And that bullet, it's lodged somewhere near the birth canal. If she goes into full labor like this..." "She'll die," Marcus finished. "Both of them will." Emma's radio crackled with static. "Rodriguez, what's your status? We've got reports of unauthorized veterinary procedures in your sector." The 3 humans exchanged glances. Park protocol was crystal clear. Injured wildlife was to be observed, not treated. Human intervention could result in suspension, criminal charges, and the end of careers. But Bella's soft whimper cut through their hesitation like a blade. "Emma," Marcus said carefully, "you need to make a choice. Report this by the book, or look the other way while Sarah and I figure out how to save them." The young ranger's face went pale. Her promotion hung in the balance, the permanent belonging she'd craved her entire life suddenly at risk. Marcus, you know I can't. The regulations exist for a reason. We're not supposed to interfere with natural—" Bella cried out, a sound that seemed to tear from her chest as another contraction hit. Her massive head turned toward Marcus, and in her eyes was a plea older than language itself. "Trust me. Save us." The same look Tommy had given him from that hospital bed in Germany when the doctors said there was nothing more they could do. Natural? Marcus's voice carried the weight of 4 decades protecting wildlife. "Sarah, how long since that bullet wound?" "Based on the tissue damage and infection pattern, maybe 10 to 12 hours. Marcus stood slowly, his joints protesting, and walked to his truck. When he returned, he carried a .308 shell casing, still warm to the touch. "Found this about 100 yards upstream. Military-grade, match-quality ammunition. This wasn't some poacher taking a desperate shot, Emma. This was deliberate. The implications hung in the mountain air like smoke. Someone had systematically tracked and wounded a pregnant bear, leaving her to die slowly. The cruelty of it made Sarah's hands tremble as she prepared a syringe of antibiotics. "So, what are we going to do?" Emma asked, her career and conscience pulling in opposite directions. Marcus crouched beside his truck's tailgate, studying the shell casing under his magnifying glass while storm clouds gathered overhead. The brass was pristine, factory fresh, with markings he recognized from his military days. This wasn't hunting ammunition, it was precision sniper rounds, the kind used by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. His blood ran cold as he noticed the tiny inscription filed into the base, JT 98. Jake Thompson. The foster son who had lived with Marcus and Helen from 1995 to 1998 until the bear attack changed everything. "Marcus?" Sarah's voice cut through his racing thoughts. "Her contractions are getting stronger. If we're going to help her, we need to decide now." But Marcus was already reaching for his radio, switching to the emergency frequency he'd hoped never to use again. "Control, this is Ranger Walker. I need an immediate background check on Jake Thompson, DOB March 15, 1980. Possible connection to wildlife crimes in the Yellowstone region." Emma's eyes widened. "Jake Thompson? Your old foster kid? Marcus, he's been out of contact for 15 years. "Not out of contact," Marcus said grimly, showing her the shell casing. "He's been very much in contact. This is his signature. He always carved his initials and the year we took him in." The radio crackled back with information that made Marcus's heart sink. Jake Thompson had been dishonorably discharged from the Army Rangers in 2010 following a psychological evaluation, multiple arrests for poaching across 5 states, outstanding warrants for wildlife trafficking. Last known address, a cabin 20 miles from their current location. Sarah looked up from where she knelt beside Bella, her face grave. "Marcus, she's hemorrhaging internally. The bullet fragments are causing tissue damage near the uterus. Without immediate surgery, she'll be dead within the hour, both mother and cubs." Cubs, plural. "I can feel at least 2, maybe 3 heartbeats, but they're in distress." Sarah's hands moved expertly over Bella's swollen belly. "The trauma is triggering premature labor. If those cubs come out now, in the wild, with their mother bleeding out—" Emma paced nervously, her radio squawking with increasingly urgent calls from headquarters. "Marcus, I have to report our position. They're asking for a status update, and if I don't respond soon, they'll send backup. When they find us treating wildlife without authorization, then don't let them find us," Marcus said quietly, removing his ranger badge and setting it on the truck's hood. "Emma, you have a choice to make. You can be the ranger who follows protocol while an innocent animal dies, or you can be the person who does what's right." The storm that had been threatening all morning finally broke, sending fat raindrops spattering against the creek stones. Bella whimpered as another contraction racked her massive frame, her eyes never leaving Marcus's face. In that moment, He saw not just the injured bear before him, but the tiny cub he'd fed every 4 hours for 3 months, the adolescent who had played in the ranger station yard, the connection that had helped him heal after Tommy's death. "She remembers you," Sarah whispered, preparing a sedative. "Look at how she's positioning herself. She's giving us access to her abdomen. She trusts you completely." Emma's radio erupted with static. "Rodriguez, we've got reports of an armed individual in your sector. Retreat to safe distance immediately and wait for backup." Armed individual. Jake was coming. Marcus made his decision.
"Sarah, do whatever you need to do to save them. Emma, get on that radio and buy us time. Tell them we're tracking a wounded animal but keeping our distance." "Marcus, I can't lie to headquarters." "You're not lying. You're interpreting the situation through the lens of officer safety." Marcus began unpacking emergency medical supplies from his truck. "Because in about 10 minutes, when Jake Thompson shows up with that rifle, officer safety is going to become our primary concern." As if summoned by his words, the distant crack of a branch breaking under a heavy boot echoed across the creek. All three humans froze, listening to the methodical approach of someone who knew these woods intimately. Someone who was in no hurry, confident in his ability to finish what he'd started. Sarah worked frantically to establish an IV line in Bella's leg, her veterinary training taking over as adrenaline sharpened her focus. "I need 15 minutes minimum to stabilize her for surgery." "Can you give me that?" Marcus checked his service weapon. 6 rounds in the cylinder, 2 speed loaders in his belt. Against a trained sniper with a high-powered rifle, it might as well have been a harsh word. But he'd been in worse situations in Vietnam, and he'd never left anyone behind then. "Emma, I need you to call for emergency backup. Tell them we have an active shooter situation." "But that will bring federal agents, the FBI." "Good. Jake's wanted on federal wildlife crimes. This just became their jurisdiction." Marcus positioned himself between the approaching footsteps and Bella, using the truck as partial cover. "And Emma? When they ask how this started, you tell them the truth. We were trying to save a life when a killer showed up to finish his work." The footsteps stopped about 50 yards away, just beyond visual range in the thick undergrowth. A voice called out, rough with years of hard living and harder choices. "Well, well, Marcus Walker." "Still playing veterinarian to every broken animal you find." Jake Thompson emerged from the pine shadows, and Marcus barely recognized the boy he'd tried to raise. The left side of Jake's face was a mass of scar tissue from the bear attack that had ended his childhood, but it was his eyes that had changed the most. They held the flat, empty stare of someone who had looked into darkness for so long that light had become foreign. "Hello, Jake." Marcus kept his voice level, paternal. "It's been a long time." "Not long enough." Jake raised his rifle with practiced ease, the scope already zeroed on Bella's head. "You always did have a weakness for lost causes, old man, but this one's personal." Emma's hand moved slowly toward her sidearm, but Jake's attention snapped to her like a predator sensing movement. "I wouldn't, little girl. I've been watching all 3 of you for the past hour. Dr. Chen, step away from the bear. Marcus, you too." "Jake, she's pregnant." Innocent cubs who never hurt anyone. Jake's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Innocent? You want to talk about innocent? I was innocent. 15 years old, trusting you when you said the bears were harmless if you respected them, respectful right up until one of them tore half my face off and left me screaming in the woods for 6 hours. Sarah never stopped working, her hands steady as she prepared the surgical instruments. "Marcus, she's going into active labor. Those cubs are coming whether we're ready or not." The first cub's cry, weak, desperate, utterly vulnerable, cut through the tension like a blade. The newborn cub's cry seemed to hang in the mountain air like a prayer, fragile and desperate. Sarah's hands moved with surgical precision as she cleared the tiny airways, her veterinary training overriding the terror of having a rifle pointed at her back. The cub was impossibly small, maybe 2 pounds, its fur dark and wet with birth fluid, but it was breathing, and that single fact gave Marcus the strength to step between Jake's weapon and the vulnerable family behind him. "Jake, listen to me," Marcus said, his voice carrying the same calm authority he'd used to talk the young man through nightmares 25 years ago. "This isn't about the bear that hurt you. That animal is long dead. This is Bella, the cub I bottle-fed after her mother was killed by poachers. She's never hurt anyone. All bears hurt someone eventually." Jake's scarred face twisted with pain that had nothing to do with old wounds.
You taught me that when you chose to save every animal in this forest except the one that mattered most? Me. Emma's radio crackled with urgent voices. All units, armed suspect confirmed in Sector 7. Federal backup en route, ETA 20 minutes. She looked at Marcus with desperate eyes. 20 minutes might as well have been 20 hours. Sarah delivered the second cub as rain began falling in earnest, turning the creek bank into treacherous mud. This one was even smaller than the first, struggling to breathe. She worked frantically with a tiny oxygen mask jury-rigged from her emergency kit, willing the fragile life to take hold. "Marcus, I need to stop the internal bleeding now, or we're going to lose the mother." Bella's eyes found Marcus across the chaotic scene, and in them he saw something that broke his heart. Complete trust, even as her life ebbed away. She was giving him permission to save her babies, accepting whatever sacrifice that required. It was the same look Helen had given him during those final hospital days when she'd made him promise to keep saving things after she was gone. "Jake, put the gun down." Marcus took another step forward, his weathered hands open and empty. "This isn't who you are. The boy I raised wouldn't murder a mother and her babies." "The boy you raised died in these woods 15 years ago, Jake snarled, but his rifle wavered slightly. "You want to know what happened that day, Marcus? I was following your tracking lessons, being respectful, making noise so I wouldn't surprise anything. But that sow had cubs, and when I came around that boulder, she saw a threat to her family, just like you see me as a threat now." Emma slowly reached for her weapon, but Jake's attention snapped to her instantly. "Don't even think about it, sweetheart. I've had you in my peripheral vision for the past 5 minutes. One twitch and I drop you before your gun clears leather." The third cub emerged stillborn, and Sarah's anguished cry echoed across the creek. She immediately began CPR on the tiny form, breathing into its miniature lungs while performing chest compressions with 2 fingers. The futility of it was heartbreaking, but she refused to give up. Every life mattered, no matter how small or seemingly hopeless. "Jesus Christ, Jake," Marcus whispered, watching the young woman fight for a life that might already be lost. "Look at her. Look at what you're doing. You're holding a gun on people trying to save lives while you destroy them. How is that justice for what happened to you?" Jake's laugh was hollow, bitter. "Justice? You want to talk about justice? I spent 6 weeks in the hospital, having my face rebuilt while you visited me twice. Twice, Marcus. Because you were too busy bottle-feeding that goddamn bear cub to sit with the kid you were supposed to protect." The accusation hit Marcus like a physical blow because it carried the sharp edge of truth. He had thrown himself into saving Bella partly to avoid dealing with Jake's trauma, telling himself the boy would recover while knowing his own guilt was too overwhelming to face directly. He'd failed his foster son in the moment Jake needed him most, and they'd both been paying the price ever since. "You're right," Marcus said quietly, his voice barely audible over the rain. "I failed you. I was so wrapped up in my own guilt about what happened that I couldn't see how much you were hurting. But killing these innocents won't fix what I broke." Sarah suddenly gasped in triumph as the third cub drew its first shuddering breath. 3 lives, all depending on the next few minutes for their survival. She looked up at Marcus with tears streaming down her face, mixing with the mountain rain. "They're all alive, but barely. I have to get this internal bleeding stopped now." Emma's radio exploded with voices. "Shots fired in Sector 7. All units respond Code 3." But no shots had been fired. Someone at headquarters was anticipating the worst. "They think someone's shooting," Emma said desperately. "Jake, when federal backup arrives, this becomes a whole different situation. Right now, you can still walk away from this. Don't make it worse." "Worse?" Jake's rifle swung toward her, then back to Marcus. "Lady, I've got nothing left to lose. 15 years of nightmares, PTSD that ended my military career, gambling debts that own my soul, and a face that scares children at grocery stores. Tell me what exactly I've got to walk away to." Marcus saw his opening in Jake's moment of vulnerability. This wasn't about revenge. It was about a broken young man who'd never learned how to heal from trauma. "Jake, I know about the debts. The FBI told us about the poaching operation. You're not a killer. You're desperate. There's a difference." "Is there?" Jake's voice cracked slightly. "I've killed 47 bears in the past 2 years, Marcus. Shot them, trapped them, poisoned their water sources. I told myself it was business, but every time I pulled that trigger, I was killing the monster that took my childhood, except the monster was never the bears. It was you, wasn't it? It was you failing to protect me when I needed you most." Sarah had opened Bella's abdomen and was working inside the incision with both hands, trying to clamp off bleeding vessels while keeping the surgical site clean in the pouring rain. It was an impossible task under the best circumstances, but she persevered with the desperate focus of someone who'd watched too many patients die despite her best efforts. Blood mixed with rainwater, turning the creek bank into a crimson mud flat. "Marcus," she called without looking up, "I need you to hold this clamp steady while I tie off this vessel. She's bleeding to death." "Don't you dare move, old man," Jake warned, but his voice lacked conviction now. The rifle in his hands seemed heavier, as if the weight of his choices was finally registering. "Then shoot me," Marcus said simply, walking toward Bella despite the weapon trained on his chest. "Because I won't watch another innocent die while I stand by doing nothing. I've failed enough people in my life, Jake. I won't fail her, too." Emma seized the moment to draw her sidearm, but instead of pointing it at Jake, she set it on the ground and kicked it away. The gesture was so unexpected that Jake actually lowered his rifle a few inches, staring at her in confusion. "What the hell are you doing?" "Making a choice," Emma said firmly. "The same choice Marcus made when he decided to raise you despite having every reason not to trust anyone after Vietnam. The same choice Sarah makes every time she treats an animal that can't pay her bills. The same choice you can make right now, to be part of the solution instead of part of the problem." Marcus knelt beside Bella and took the surgical clamp from Sarah's blood-stained hands. The massive bear's breathing was shallow but steady, and when she felt his touch, she turned her head slightly to nuzzle his arm. Even in her extremity, she remembered kindness. The sound of approaching helicopters began to echo off the canyon walls, growing louder by the second. Federal backup was arriving ahead of schedule, which meant Jake's window for escape was closing rapidly. He could kill all 3 of them and face certain death when the FBI arrived, or he could choose a different ending to this story. "Jake," Marcus said softly, his hands steady as he assisted Sarah's delicate work, "what do you think Helen would want you to do right now?" The mention of Marcus's deceased wife seemed to break something inside Jake. Helen had been the one who'd tucked him in during those first terrifying nights in foster care, who'd made his favorite chocolate chip cookies when the nightmares got too bad, who'd visited him every day in the hospital after the bear attack while Marcus struggled with his own demons. "Helen would want me to be the man she thought I could become," Jake whispered, tears mixing with the rain on his scarred cheeks. "But I don't know how to be that person anymore, Marcus. I don't know how to stop being angry." Sarah looked up from her work,
her eyes bright with exhaustion and hope. The bleeding stopped. She's stable, and the cubs are responding well. They're going to live, all of them. The helicopters were directly overhead now, the rotor wash adding chaos to an already desperate situation. Through the trees, Marcus could see federal agents taking positions, preparing for a standoff that could end in tragedy for everyone involved. "Jake," he called over the noise, "whatever happens next, I want you to know something. I loved you like a son. I failed you, but I loved you, and Helen loved you too. That's why she kept your room exactly the way you left it for 10 years after you disappeared." The rifle slipped from Jake's nerveless fingers, clattering onto the rocky creek bank as 25 years of suppressed grief finally overwhelmed his anger. The rifle hit the wet stones with a metallic clang that seemed to echo through the canyon like a bell tolling. Jake Thompson stood frozen in the rain, his scarred hands trembling as 25 years of rage drained out of him, leaving behind only the broken 15-year-old boy who'd screamed for his foster father while blood poured from his mangled face. Federal agents emerged from the tree line with weapons drawn, their tactical gear black against the storm-darkened pines. But Marcus only had eyes for the man he'd failed to save decades ago. "Drop to your knees! Hands behind your head!" The lead agent's voice cut through the helicopter noise like a blade, but Jake seemed not to hear. He was staring at Bella's newborn cubs, now nestled against their mother's warm belly, their tiny mouths working instinctively as they sought their first meal, life persisting despite everything that had tried to destroy it. "Jake," Marcus said gently, rising slowly from beside the injured bear with his hands visible, "they need you to get down on the ground. Don't give them a reason to hurt you." "She really kept my room?" Jake's voice was that of a lost child, barely audible over the rotor wash. "For 10 years? Exactly the way you left it. Your baseball trophies on the dresser, that model airplane we built together still hanging from the ceiling. Helen dusted it every week." Marcus took a careful step toward his former foster son, ignoring the federal agent's shouted warnings. "She never stopped believing you'd come home." Emma watched the scene unfold with her heart hammering against her ribs. The federal agents were getting nervous, their fingers tight on triggers as they tried to assess whether Jake was surrendering or preparing for a final desperate act. She keyed her radio with shaking hands. "Control, this is Rodriguez. Suspect appears to be surrendering. Request tactical team, hold position. We have injured wildlife and ongoing medical emergency." Sarah worked frantically to stabilize Bella for transport, knowing that the next hour would determine whether her surgical intervention had been enough. The bear's vital signs were weak but steady, and the cubs were showing encouraging signs of strength, but she needed a proper surgical suite, controlled conditions, equipment that didn't exist in the wilderness. "Marcus, we need to get her to my clinic immediately," Sarah called out, never taking her eyes off her patient. "The internal repairs will hold for now, but if infection sets in..." Agent Rebecca Torres, the federal team leader, advanced cautiously with her weapon trained on Jake. She'd seen enough standoffs to recognize the moment when a suspect's fight finally left them, but experience had taught her that broken people were often the most dangerous. "Sir, I need you on the ground now." "Hands where I can see them." Jake finally seemed to hear her, his eyes focusing on the present moment. He looked at the rifle lying in the mud, then at Marcus, then at the 3 bear cubs whose lives hung in the balance. Slowly, he sank to his knees in the creekside gravel. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he said, his voice cracking. I wanted you to hurt the way I'd been hurting. But watching her fight for her babies, seeing what you risked to save them." He gestured helplessly at Bella, who was gently licking her cubs with maternal tenderness that transcended species. "This is who you really are, isn't it? This is who you've always been."
Marcus felt his own eyes fill with tears as Agent Torres cuffed Jake with professional efficiency. This is who Helen saw in both of us, son. The capacity for love, even when we're drowning in our own pain. The helicopter medics were already preparing a makeshift gurney for Bella, though transporting a 400-pound bear presented logistical challenges they'd never encountered. Sarah supervised every aspect of the operation with fierce determination, refusing to let bureaucracy or inexperience compromise her patients' care. "Dr. Chen?" Agent Torres called over the noise. "We're going to need a full medical report for the federal case. This animal is evidence in a wildlife trafficking investigation." "This animal is a patient," Sarah snapped, her professional demeanor cracking under the strain. "She's not evidence. She's a mother fighting for her life. Your investigation can wait until she's stable." Emma stepped between the federal agent and the veterinarian, her ranger authority suddenly crucial in navigating the jurisdictional maze. "Agent Torres, Dr. Chen has my full authorization to provide emergency medical care. The investigation can proceed once we've secured the scene and ensured all parties are safe." As the medical team worked to stabilize Bella for transport, Marcus knelt beside Jake, who remained cuffed but no longer seemed dangerous. The federal agents maintained their perimeter, but the immediate crisis had passed, leaving behind the complex work of understanding how they'd arrived at this moment. "Jake, I need you to know something," Marcus said quietly, his voice meant for Jake alone. "The night you left, Helen and I sat up until dawn, talking about what we could have done differently. We knew we'd failed you, but we didn't know how to fix it. That guilt has eaten at me for 15 years. Jake's scarred face contorted with emotion. "I ran because I couldn't stand to see the way you looked at me. Like I was broken. Like the bear attack had turned me into something you couldn't love anymore. No, son. I looked at you like someone I'd failed to protect. The shame was mine, not yours." Marcus glanced at the federal agents, then back at Jake. "When they ask you about the poaching operation, tell them the truth, about the debts, about the desperation, about everything. Don't protect anyone who deserves to go down for this." Agent Torres approached with a satellite phone, her expression grim. "Mr. Walker, I've got some information you need to hear. Jake Thompson wasn't working alone. We've been tracking an interstate wildlife trafficking ring for 2 years, and your foster son was small-time compared to the main operation." The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. "You're saying there are others?" "At least 12 suspects across 5 states, moving everything from bear bile to exotic bird feathers. Mr. Thompson's cooperation could help us bring down the entire network." Torres looked at Jake with calculating eyes. "Which brings us to the question of charges." Sarah looked up from where she was monitoring Bella's breathing. "What do you mean, charges? He surrendered without firing a shot." "He's wanted on multiple federal warrants, Dr. Chen. Conspiracy to traffic endangered species, violations of the Lacey Act, firearms charges. We're looking at potentially decades in federal prison." Emma felt the weight of impossible choices settling on her shoulders. Jake had committed serious crimes, but he'd also just experienced what looked like a genuine breakdown and potential redemption. The letter of the law demanded punishment, but the spirit of justice suggested that healing might be more important than retribution. "Agent Torres," Emma said carefully, "what if Mr. Thompson agreed to full cooperation with the federal investigation? Complete disclosure of his contacts, methods, everything? That would be taken into consideration during sentencing, but it wouldn't eliminate the charges." Jake looked up from his position on the muddy ground, meeting Marcus's eyes with a clarity that had been absent for years. "I'll tell them everything, Marcus. Every name, every location, every method they taught me. Maybe I can help stop some of this before more animals get hurt." Bella chose that moment to stir, lifting her massive head to check on her cubs. The sight of her babies nursing successfully seemed to give her strength, and she managed a soft chuff of contentment that carried across the creek like a blessing. All three humans, Marcus, Sarah, and Emma, felt something shift inside them at the sound. Life persisting, love enduring, hope surviving despite everything arrayed against it. "Jake," Marcus said, helping his foster son to his feet despite the handcuffs. "Helen used to say that redemption isn't about erasing your mistakes. It's about making sure they lead to something better. Maybe this is your chance to turn 15 years of anger into something that actually helps the world." Agent Torres checked her watch, calculating timelines and jurisdictions. "The preliminary hearing will be in Denver next week. Mr. Thompson, if you're serious about cooperation, now's the time to prove it." As the federal helicopter prepared to transport Jake into custody, he turned back toward the creek where Bella lay with her cubs. "Marcus, will you make sure they're okay? The cubs, I mean. Will you watch over them the way you should have watched over me?" "I promise," Marcus said. And this time, he meant it with every fiber of his being. 3 days after Jake's arrest, Marcus received the phone call that shattered what little peace he'd found. Sarah's voice was tight with professional control, barely containing panic as she delivered the news from her veterinary clinic. Bella's condition had deteriorated rapidly overnight. The internal bleeding had resumed, complicated by a massive infection that her weakened immune system couldn't fight. "Marcus, you need to get here now," Sarah said, her words clipped and urgent. "She's not responding to antibiotics. Her temperature is 105, blood pressure dropping, and the cubs—" Her voice broke slightly. "The cubs haven't been able to nurse properly since yesterday. They're losing weight fast." Marcus drove the 40 miles to Sarah's clinic in 28 minutes, his truck's emergency flashers cutting through the mountain darkness while his mind raced through worst-case scenarios. He'd made a promise to Jake, to Helen's memory, to himself, that he wouldn't fail again. But as he pulled into the clinic parking lot and saw Sarah waiting by the door with tears streaming down her face, he knew that some promises were beyond human ability to keep. Inside the clinic, Bella lay motionless on the largest surgical table Sarah could construct, her magnificent frame reduced to labored breathing and the steady beep of monitoring equipment. The 3 cubs huddled in an incubator nearby, their cries growing weaker by the hour as their mother's condition prevented normal nursing. Emma sat beside the incubator with a tiny bottle trying to coax formula into cubs who instinctively knew something was terribly wrong. "The infection spread faster than anything I've seen," Sarah explained, her veterinary training warring with her emotional investment in the case. "It's antibiotic resistant, probably picked up from the bullet fragments." "I've tried everything. Broad-spectrum antibiotics, anti-inflammatories, even experimental treatments that could cost me my license." Marcus approached Bella slowly, his weathered hands gentle as he stroked her massive head. Her eyes opened at his touch, but they were clouded with fever and pain. Still, she managed to lift her head slightly, pressing her muzzle against his palm in a gesture of trust that broke his heart. "What are her chances?" Marcus asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Honestly, maybe 10%. And even if she survives the infection, the internal damage is extensive. She might never fully recover." Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Marcus, I think we need to discuss humane options." The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Euthanasia. The final admission of defeat. The acknowledgement that sometimes love meant letting go, rather than clinging to false hope. Marcus had faced this decision twice before, with his cancer-stricken wife and his wounded son, and both times he'd been forced to accept the limitations of human will against nature's cruel indifference. Emma looked up from feeding the cubs, her face pale with exhaustion and grief. "There's something else, Marcus. Agent Torres called an hour ago. The media got hold of the story. CNN, Fox News, every major network is running coverage of Ranger risks life for bear family. We've got reporters camping outside the park entrance. The irony was devastating. Marcus had spent 40 years working in anonymous dedication to wildlife conservation, and now his most heartbreaking failure was becoming a national news story. The thought of strangers judging his choices, debating Bella's worth while she lay dying, made him feel physically ill. "That's not all," Emma continued reluctantly. "Park headquarters called. There's going to be a formal investigation into our actions. Unauthorized veterinary procedures, violation of wildlife protection protocols, endangering federal agents. Marcus, they're talking about criminal charges." Sarah slammed her hand against the examination table, startling everyone in the room. "Criminal charges? For trying to save lives? For showing basic compassion? What kind of world have we created where mercy is a crime?" But Marcus wasn't listening to the bureaucratic implications anymore. He was focused entirely on Bella, on the rhythm of her labored breathing, on the trust she continued to show despite her suffering. In her eyes, he saw echoes of every patient he'd failed to save, every promise he'd been unable to keep. Tommy dying in that German hospital, Helen wasting away despite the best medical care money could buy, Jake's childhood innocence destroyed by trauma he couldn't prevent. "Dr. Chen," he said quietly, "how long do we have to make this decision?" "Hours, maybe less. If we're going to ease her suffering, it should be soon." Marcus nodded slowly, then turned to Emma. "I need you to call Agent Torres. Tell her I want to speak with Jake." "Marcus, he's in federal custody. They're not going to—" "Tell her it's his last chance to say goodbye to the bear he tried to kill. Tell her it might be important for the psychological evaluation they're doing for his sentencing hearing." Marcus's voice carried the authority of 4 decades making impossible decisions. "Sometimes the most important conversations happen at bedsides, Emma. She'll understand." An hour later, Jake Thompson sat in the clinic's small office, his hands cuffed, but his federal escorts allowing him a moment of privacy with Marcus. The scarred man looked older than his 43 years, hollowed out by guilt and sleepless nights in a federal holding cell. "She's dying because of me," Jake said without preamble, his voice raw with emotion he'd tried to suppress for days. "She's dying because life is fragile and sometimes good intentions aren't enough," Marcus corrected gently. "The infection would have killed her whether you'd shot her or not." Sarah said the internal injuries were too severe to heal completely. "But I started it. I put her in that position." Jake looked toward the examination room where Bella struggled for each breath. "Marcus, I need to tell you something about why I really came back here." Marcus waited, sensing that whatever Jake was about to reveal would change everything. "I've been watching you for months, tracking your patrol routes, studying your wildlife rescue operations. I told myself I was planning revenge, but—" Jake's voice cracked. "I think I was really just trying to understand how you could care so much about broken things when you couldn't fix the most broken thing of all, me." The confession hit Marcus like a physical blow. Jake hadn't returned as a predator seeking vengeance. He'd come back as a wounded child still desperately seeking his father's love. "Jake, Let me finish. Please." Jake's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I want to pay for her medical care. Everything. The surgery, the medication, the specialized equipment. I've got money from the poaching, blood money that needs to be cleaned somehow." In the examination room, Bella's breathing had become even more labored, and Sarah was preparing the injection that would end her suffering peacefully. Time was running out for all of them. At 3:17 a.m., just as Sarah prepared the final injection that would end Bella's suffering, Emma burst through the clinic doors with news that would change everything. Her face was flushed with exhaustion and excitement as she clutched a manila folder thick with documents and photographs. "Don't give her that shot," Emma gasped, still catching her breath from her midnight drive. Marcus, Jake, you need to see this. The FBI lab results came back on those bullet fragments Sarah removed from Bella. Agent Torres followed Emma into the clinic, her professional composure cracking slightly as she witnessed the scene. A dying bear surrounded by people who'd risked everything to save her, federal prisoner in handcuffs weeping over his own cruelty, and 3 tiny cubs whose survival hung in the balance. The bullets weren't Jake's, Torres announced, her voice cutting through the medical beeping and quiet sobs. Ballistics analysis shows they came from a different weapon entirely. Military-grade ammunition, yes, but fired from a rifle Jake never owned. Jake's head snapped up, confusion replacing guilt in his scarred features. That's impossible. I shot her. I remember pulling the trigger. You shot at her, Torres corrected, opening the folder to reveal crime scene photographs and ballistics reports. But you missed. The bullet fragments we recovered from Bella's body match weapons registered to Vincent Carraway, a former military contractor who's been running the wildlife trafficking operation Jake was working for. Marcus felt the world tilt on its axis. You're saying Jake didn't actually hurt Bella? The evidence suggests Mr. Thompson fired a warning shot that spooked the bear, causing her to flee toward Carraway's position. Carraway then shot her, probably intending to blame the killing on Thompson if anyone investigated. Torres looked at Jake with something approaching sympathy. You've been carrying guilt for a crime you didn't commit. Sarah looked up from her patient, medical instruments forgotten as the implications sank in. But that means, Jake, you never actually killed any bears, did you? The revelation shattered something inside Jake Thompson. 25 years of self-hatred, of believing himself to be a monster, crumbled in an instant. He doubled over as if physically struck, great wrenching sobs tearing from his chest as he finally understood the truth. I couldn't do it, he whispered between sobs. Every time Carraway sent me out, I told myself I'd finally have the courage to kill one. But I'd get them in my sights, see the way they moved, the way they cared for their families, and I'd shoot over their heads instead. I'd go back and tell Carraway they got away. Marcus knelt beside his foster son, ignoring the handcuffs as he pulled Jake into an embrace. You never were a killer, son. Deep down, you're still the boy who cried when he found that injured sparrow in our backyard. Emma was studying the FBI documents with growing excitement. There's more, Marcus. Carraway's been using Jake as a scapegoat for months. Every kill Jake reported was actually Carraway cleaning up loose ends after Jake scared the animals away. The FBI has been tracking a systematic slaughter, but Jake was unknowingly protecting the bears by warning them off. Agent Torres nodded grimly. Mr. Thompson, your failures as a poacher actually saved dozens of lives. Carraway's been tracking your routes and killing the animals you warned away, but many others escaped because of your missed shots. But even as the truth emerged, Bella's condition continued to deteriorate. Her breathing became increasingly shallow, and the monitor alarms began sounding more frequently. Sarah returned to her patient with renewed determination, but the infection was winning despite all their efforts. Marcus, Sarah said quietly, knowing Jake didn't shoot her doesn't change her medical condition. The infection is too advanced. We're losing her. Jake struggled to his feet, his cuffed hands making the movement awkward. Let me see her. Please, I need to apologize for all the fear I caused her. Agent Torres looked skeptical, but Marcus nodded. 5 minutes, under supervision. They approached Bella's bedside together, Marcus, Jake, Emma, and Sarah forming a circle around the dying bear. Bella's eyes opened as they drew near, and she focused on Jake with what seemed like recognition. Instead of fear or aggression, her expression held something that looked remarkably like understanding. I'm sorry, girl, Jake whispered, his voice breaking. I never wanted to hurt you. I was just so angry, so lost." He reached out with his cuffed hands, and incredibly Bella lifted her massive head to nuzzle his fingers. In that moment of connection between man and bear, something shifted in the room's energy. Sarah noticed it first. Bella's breathing seemed to stabilize slightly, the wild rhythm of her heartbeat settling into something more regular. Emma was still reading through the FBI files when she gasped. "Marcus, there's something else here. DNA analysis of the crime scene. Jake, the bear that attacked you when you were 15. It wasn't just any random bear." "What do you mean?" "It was Bella's mother. She was protecting a den site where Bella and her siblings were hibernating. You were walking directly toward baby bears, and she was doing what any mother would do." The revelation hit Jake like a thunderbolt. The attack that had shaped his entire adult life, the trauma that had driven him to hatred and self-destruction, had been an act of maternal protection, exactly what Bella was fighting for now with her own cubs. "So the mother who scarred me was protecting Bella," Jake said slowly, the cosmic irony of it overwhelming. "And now Bella is dying because Carraway used my guilt to manipulate me into leading him to her family." Marcus saw something change in Jake's face, the last of his anger finally giving way to understanding. "Jake, do you see it now? The circle of protection, of family caring for family? That's what this has always been about." But their moment of realization was interrupted by a crisis. One of Bella's cubs, the smallest of the three, had stopped breathing. Sarah immediately began CPR on the tiny form, her skilled hands working desperately to restart the fragile heartbeat. "Come on, baby," she whispered, breathing into miniature lungs. "Your mama's fighting to stay alive for you. You can't give up now." Jake watched the struggle with growing desperation. This cub would die because of choices he'd made, manipulated or not. The cycle of death that had defined his adult life was claiming another innocent victim. Without warning, Jake dropped to his knees beside the examination table. "Bella," he said urgently, "you have to fight. Your babies need you. I know I don't deserve forgiveness for what I've put you through, but please, don't let my mistakes cost them their lives." As if responding to his plea, Bella lifted her head with tremendous effort and released a soft chuff toward her struggling cub. The sound seemed to reach something primal in the tiny bear, and suddenly it drew a shuddering breath. Sarah looked up with tears of relief streaming down her face. "Heartbeat's back. Breathing is stabilized. My God, it's like she called him back to life." Emma was frantically working her radio, coordinating with the FBI team that was preparing to arrest Vincent Carraway. "Marcus, they need Jake's testimony to make the charges stick. If we can prove Carraway manipulated him into leading them to the bears—" "Jake's going to testify," Marcus said firmly, looking at his foster son with pride for the first time in decades. "Aren't you, son?" Jake nodded, his scarred face set with determination. "Everything, every manipulation, every lie, every innocent animal Carraway killed while using my guilt as cover. I'll tell them everything." Agent Torres stepped forward, her phone buzzing with updates from the field team. "Mr. Thompson, if your testimony helps us convict Carraway and dismantle this trafficking network, the federal prosecutor is prepared to discuss a plea agreement, community service, restitution, counseling, but no prison time." The offer hung in the air like hope made tangible. Jake looked at Marcus, then at Bella and her cubs, then at the people who'd risked everything to save lives he'd thought he'd been destroying. "I don't deserve mercy," Jake said quietly. "None of us deserve mercy," Marcus replied, his hand on Jake's shoulder, "but sometimes we get it anyway. The question is, what we do with that gift." As dawn broke over the Montana mountains, casting golden light through the clinic windows, Bella's fever finally broke. Her breathing strengthened, her eyes cleared, and for the first time in days, she managed to nurse all 3 cubs successfully. The impossible had happened. They were all going to live. 1 year later, Marcus Walker stood at the edge of the same creek where everything had changed, watching 3 healthy bear cubs tumble through the autumn leaves under their mother's watchful eye. Bella had grown even more magnificent in the months since her recovery, her black coat gleaming in the golden afternoon light as she supervised her children's play with the patient authority of a mother who'd fought death itself to protect them. "She brings them here every month," Emma said, joining Marcus at the observation point they'd built 50 yards from the creek. "Same day, almost to the hour. It's like she's keeping an appointment." Emma wore the silver badge of Yellowstone's chief ranger now, her promotion coming after the congressional hearing that had vindicated their actions and led to sweeping reforms in wildlife protection protocols. The Walker method was now official park policy, immediate intervention to save lives when human activity caused the crisis, regardless of bureaucratic restrictions. "How's Sarah doing with the new facility?" Marcus asked, gesturing toward the state-of-the-art wildlife rehabilitation center that had risen from the federal compensation funds awarded after Vincent Carraway's conviction. "Busier than ever. She's got 12 bears in rehabilitation right now, plus the usual collection of injured elk, eagles, and smaller wildlife. The foundation Jake established is funding similar centers in 4 other states." Emma smiled, watching the cubs wrestle near the water's edge. She says it's the first time in her life she's felt like she was making a real difference. Dr. Sarah Chen had indeed found her calling in the aftermath of their desperate creekside surgery. The Chen Wildlife Rehabilitation Center now employed 8 full-time veterinarians and had treated over 300 animals in its first year of operation. More importantly, Sarah had found personal healing in her work, adopting 2 children whose teenage mother had died in a car accident, creating the family she'd always wanted. Marcus pulled out his phone to check the time. Jake should be here soon with the new group. As if summoned by his words, the sound of children's laughter echoed through the forest as Jake Thompson emerged from the trail with 12 foster children ranging in age from 8 to 16. His scarred face was animated with genuine joy as he pointed out animal tracks in the mud, sharing wilderness wisdom that Marcus had taught him decades ago. "Mr. Jake, is that really the bear you tried to shoot?" asked a girl of about 10, her voice filled with the fearless curiosity of childhood. "That's her," Jake replied, his voice carrying no shame now, only wonder. "And the most important thing I learned is that when you're angry and hurting, it's easy to blame the wrong things for your pain. Bella never hurt anyone. I was just looking for something to hate so I wouldn't have to hate myself." The federal plea agreement had required Jake to perform 3,000 hours of community service working with traumatized foster children. What had begun as court-ordered punishment had evolved into his life's mission. The Jake Thompson Foundation now operated therapeutic wilderness programs in 7 states, helping children who'd experienced trauma learn to trust again through interaction with wildlife. "Does she remember you being mean to her?" asked a boy with haunted eyes that reminded Marcus of Jake at that age. "I think she remembers me being lost," Jake answered thoughtfully. "But bears are smarter than people sometimes. She forgave me before I forgave myself." Marcus watched this exchange with profound satisfaction. The broken boy he'd failed to save had grown into a man who specialized in healing other broken children. The irony wasn't lost on him that Jake's greatest trauma had ultimately become his greatest strength. Emma's radio crackled with a familiar voice. "Chief Rodriguez, this is Dr. Chen. I'm about 10 minutes out with our special guest." "Copy that, Sarah. We're all here waiting." The special guest was Marcus's newest family member, Emma Rodriguez Walker, his officially adopted daughter, who now carried his name with pride. The adoption papers had been finalized on Emma's 29th birthday, with Jake serving as a witness and Bella's cubs playing in the background. "Better late than never," Marcus had said, echoing the words that had become their family motto. As Sarah's vehicle approached, Marcus reflected on the impossible journey that had brought them all to this moment. The Creekside crisis that had nearly destroyed them had instead forged bonds stronger than blood, creating a chosen family that defied every conventional definition. Vincent Carraway had been sentenced to 30 years in federal prison for his role in the wildlife trafficking conspiracy. The investigation had revealed a network spanning 12 states and involving over $2 million in illegal animal parts. Jake's testimony had been crucial to the prosecution, his detailed knowledge of the operation's methods helping federal agents arrest 43 co-conspirators. Sarah emerged from her vehicle carrying a small bundle that immediately captured everyone's attention. Her newest patient, a 3-month-old black bear cub whose mother had been killed by poachers in Montana. The orphaned cub would need bottle feeding every 4 hours for the next several months, just as Bella had needed 15 years ago. "Everyone meet Hope," Sarah announced, cradling the tiny bear with practiced expertise. "She's going to need a very special kind of family to help her grow up strong." Marcus approached slowly, his weathered hands gentle as he offered a finger for the cub to sniff. Hope immediately latched on, her tiny mouth working instinctively as she recognized the scent of someone who understood bear cubs. The circle was completing itself in the most beautiful way possible. Jake knelt beside them, his foster children gathering around to witness the miracle of new life. "Marcus, would it be okay if I helped with her care? I know I don't deserve the chance, but Jake, you don't need to earn the right to be part of this family anymore," Marcus said firmly. "You've been my son since the day you walked into our house 28 years ago. The only thing that's changed is that we're all finally brave enough to say it out loud." Emma pulled out her phone to capture the moment. Marcus bottle-feeding Hope while surrounded by Jake's foster children, Bella watching from the creek with her own thriving cubs, Sarah documenting everything for her research, and 3 generations of chosen family learning that love wasn't about blood relationships or perfect histories. "You know what Helen would say if she could see this?" Marcus asked, his voice thick with emotion. "What's that, Dad?" Emma asked, the word Dad still new enough on her tongue to make Marcus's heart skip. "She'd say we finally figured out what family really means. It's not about the people you're born to, it's about the people who show up when everything falls apart, who choose to stay when staying is hard, who help you become the person you were meant to be." As the afternoon sun began to set over Yellowstone's ancient peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Bella approached the human gathering with her cubs trailing behind. She stopped just 10 feet away, closer than any wild bear should ever come to humans, and sat down with the patient dignity of a mother who'd seen her children through the darkest of times. Hope looked up from her bottle toward the magnificent wild bear who represented everything she might become, strong, protective, capable of both fierce independence and profound trust. In that moment, surrounded by people who'd learned that the hardest promises to keep were often the most important, Marcus felt the weight of 4 decades of guilt finally lifting from his shoulders. Jake's voice broke the peaceful silence. "Marcus, I know I put everyone through hell, but I need you to know everything that happened, all the pain and mistakes and second chances, it was worth it to end up here, with all of you, watching Hope get the kind of family I never thought I deserved." "You always deserved it, son," Marcus replied, passing the bottle to Jake so he could experience the profound joy of feeding new life. "We just had to learn how to forgive ourselves first." As darkness fell over the wilderness and the first stars appeared in the Montana sky, 3 generations of bears and humans shared the ancient ritual of family, protection, forgiveness, hope, and the unshakable knowledge that love, once given freely, multiplies endlessly. The creek continued its eternal song, carrying with it the promise that some bonds, once forged in crisis and tempered by forgiveness, would endure as long as the mountains themselves stood sentinel over the wild places where broken hearts could finally heal. In the distance, Hope's contented sighs mixed with the gentle sounds of Bella's family settling in for the night, and Marcus Walker finally understood what Helen had been trying to tell him all along. The greatest victories weren't about saving everyone, but about choosing to keep trying, one precious life at a time. Dear friends, at 65, Marcus Walker thought his best years were behind him. Drowning in medical debt, haunted by the son he lost in Iraq, and facing mandatory retirement from the only job that gave his life meaning. How many of us know that feeling? The empty nest, the financial struggles, the weight of promises we couldn't keep to those we've loved and lost. But sometimes, life gives us one more chance to matter. When Marcus risked everything to save a dying bear and her cubs, he discovered something profound. Family isn't about blood or perfect histories. It's about showing up when everything falls apart. His broken foster son, Jake, his adopted daughter, Emma, and Dr. Sarah Chen became the family he never knew he needed. At an age when society tells us we're winding down, Marcus learned we can still write our most important chapters. The medical bills that seemed insurmountable became manageable when shared with chosen family. The guilt over past failures transformed into wisdom that healed broken children. Sometimes our greatest tragedies become our most powerful tools for helping others heal. Your story isn't over. It's just waiting for the next chapter of unexpected grace. Questions for you. What promise from your past still weighs on your heart, and how might it become a source of healing for someone else today? Have you discovered that your empty nest years could actually be your most meaningful ones? Please share your thoughts in the comments. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.